Assalamu alaikum. In this video, I'll present our research on the triple bind, shattering Sabah's youth and the crisis of human capital sustainability. Despite of natural resource wealth, Sabah has remained Malaysia's poorest state for more than 4 decades. Today, nearly half of its population is under the age of 35, making youth not only the most affected group, but also the key to Sabah's future. This study asks a critical question. Why has poverty in Sabah persisted across generations despite decades of policy intervention? We propose that Sabah's youth are trapped in what we call a triple bind, an interlocking system of poverty, educational deprivation, and early marriage. These are not isolated social problems. They operate as a self-reinforcing system that systematically erodes human capital and reproduces intergenerational disadvantage. Okay, now, talking about methodology, how the study was done. This study employs qualitative document analysis. This approach allows us to move beyond numbers toward meaning, context, and system behavior. Let's start with the first element of triple bind, which is poverty. Our first finding confirms that poverty in Sabah is structural, not temporary. From 1976 to 2022, Sabah consistently recorded the highest poverty rate in Malaysia. While national poverty declined steadily, Sabah's poverty fluctuated and rebounded, revealing fragility rather than resilience. From a youth development perspective, poverty forces families to prioritize short-term survival over long-term education, creating the first lock in the triple bind. All right? Our study identifies 5 interrelated poverty themes that form the foundation of the triple bind. First, persistent structural poverty shows that poverty in Sabah is long-term and systemic, not temporary, shaping youth lives from birth. Second, spatial inequality highlights how rural and remote districts experience deeper deprivation, placing youth at a structural disadvantage compared to their urban peers. Third, economic precarity at the household level forces families to prioritize immediate survival, making education a negotiable cost rather than a protected investment. Fourth, limited economic mobility reveals that poverty is reinforced by a lack of viable employment pathways, especially for young people without qualifications. Finally, intergenerational transmission of poverty indicates that youth inherit not only low income but constrained aspirations and reduced life options. The implication for youth is clear. Poverty is not merely a background condition, it is the starting point that narrows educational, economic, and social trajectories, making young people highly vulnerable to dropout, early marriage, and long-term labor market exclusion. Now, let's look at the second element of triple bind, that is, educational deprivation, that emerges as the second mechanism. Dropout rates in Sabah range between 1.5% and 3% annually, with cumulative rates reaching 10 to 15% by Form 5, and far higher in remote districts. Education is no longer a ladder, it becomes a luxury for B40. Our study identifies 5 critical themes related to educational deprivation among youth in Sabah. First, cumulative school dropout shows that while annual dropout may appear moderate, its accumulation across schooling years results in substantial educational loss among youth. Second, rural and geographic exclusion highlights how distance, transport hardship, and school accessibility systematically disadvantage youth in remote districts. Third, gendered educational vulnerability reveals that girls are more likely to discontinue schooling under economic pressure, increasing their exposure to early marriage and dependency. Fourth, weak post-secondary transition indicates that limited pathways into tertiary education or skills training trap youth in low-skill trajectories. Finally, loss of education as a protective space underscores that once youth exit school, they lose not only learning opportunities, but also social protection, guidance, and future orientation. When we analyze the implication for youth, poverty is not merely a background condition. It is the starting point that narrows educational, economic, and social trajectories, making young people highly vulnerable to dropout, early marriage, and long-term labor market exclusion. Okay, the last triple bind reframes early marriage. In Sabah, early marriage is not primarily cultural. It is a structural economic coping mechanism. Once marriage occurs, educational exit becomes permanent to most cases, locking youth into low-skill, informal labor. Here, we identify 5 key themes explaining early marriage among youth in Sabah. First, marriage as economic survival shows that early marriage functions as a response to household poverty rather than a purely cultural choice. Second, marriage as an exit from education highlights that school discontinuation often precedes early marriage, making marriage a default pathway once education collapses. Third, gendered vulnerability reveals that young women are disproportionately affected, with early marriage limiting autonomy, skills development, and economic participation. Fourth, legal and institutional discretion indicates that regulatory flexibility enables early marriage to persist when economic pressures remain unresolved. Finally, spatial concentration in high-poverty districts demonstrates that early marriage clusters where poverty, limited access, and weak educational infrastructure intersect. The implication for youth is very direct. Early marriage permanently restructures life trajectories to most cases, locking young people, especially girls, into low-skill, dependent roles and reinforcing long-term labor market exclusion. Education is no longer a ladder, it becomes a luxury for B40. Okay, what we suggest to unlock this triple and breaking the generational poverty in Sabah. First, economic activism is essential. While legal minimum ages are important, early marriage will persist unless youth and families have real economic alternatives. Removing marriage as a financial necessity requires income-generating opportunities, social protection, and community-level economic support. Second, breaking the triple bind demands multi-sectoral action. Youth development policies must work simultaneously across poverty reduction, education, and social protection. Keeping girls in school beyond the age of 18 is especially critical to unlocking Sabah's long-term human capital potential. Third, youth development must prioritize skills and competencies. Education and training systems should focus on market-relevant skills, digital literacy, and employability, ensuring youth can transition into productive and sustainable livelihoods rather than informal survival work. Finally, a transformative framework is required. Legal reforms alone are insufficient. They must be paired with economic diversification and labor market inclusion, so youth are presented with viable life pathways that make early marriage unnecessary. In short, youth development in Sabah must shift from reactive protection to proactive transformation. What we suggest to unlock this triple and breaking the generational poverty in Sabah. The triple bind is not a failure of young people. It is a failure of the system surrounding them. Breaking this bind requires more than protection or enforcement. It demands transformative, coordinated action that restores education, expands economic opportunity, and returns agency to Sabah's youth. If Sabah is to secure its future human capital, youth development must move beyond short-term solutions toward long-term structural change. Thank you.